When did the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints stop practicing polygamy? The answer might be a bit more complicated than you think. When I was writing my book, American Zion and New History of Mormonism, then when I went on my speaking tour to talk to people about the book, one of the most frequently asked questions was, when did polygamy end? Now, the traditional narrative that you'll frequently see trotted out is that the LDS Church denounced polygamy in 1890 and has been monogamous ever since. But that's not quite right. So in this video, I thought I'd follow up. I recently did a video on the origins of polygamy and the documentary record of Joseph Smith marrying a plural wife who was a teenage girl named Sarah Ann Whitney in Nauvoo. For this video, I thought I'd talk about the end of polygamy, or rather, let's call it the ends of polygamy, because I'm going to talk about three different manifestos. You may be familiar with the first one, the 1890 Manifesto, issued by Wilford Woodruff, the president of the church, but I'm going to talk about two others in 1904 and 1933, and how that long history can tell us how difficult it was for Mormonism to forego what had been considered a central doctrine, and why it still has many lingering questions today. Let's dig in. Now, it's going to be hard to keep this short because each one of these manifestos could be the focus of an entire video. In fact, several videos, and maybe I'll do future videos on these topics where I can dig in further. But in brief, it may be hard for us to comprehend now with Latter-day Saint leaders being so buttoned up and law-abiding and conservative. But LDS leaders spent most of the 1880s as fugitives from the law. Congress had passed a series of legislation that had criminalized cohabitation, or the living with multiple women, which was their way to imprison those who practiced polygamy. And that included LDS leaders. In fact, thousands of Latter-day Saint men and women were thrown in prison in the 1880s as a result of this legislation. And this included prominent LDS leaders like George Buchanan. This was the time that he spent in the Utah penitentiary as a result of being convicted of cohabitation. This was known as the Underground Period. Now, president of the church at that time was John Taylor, the third president. He became the LDS prophet after Brigham Young died in 1877. And he was a stalwart defender of polygamy. He spent a large portion of his prophetic tenure as a fugitive from the law, running from secret home to secret location and making very few public appearances, especially in the final 2 years of his life. He also claimed several revelations that dictated that polygamy was a core doctrine of Latter-day Saint Church, necessary for exaltation, and would never be given up. As a result, he had to remain in hiding. Several of his counselors and the apostles had to leave to Hawaii or Mexico or Canada or Britain to escape the law, and he refused to give an inch. Now, when he died in 1887, eventually the prophetic mantle fell on Wilford Woodruff. Now, at first, Wilford Woodruff seemed to be as adamant as John Taylor that they would never give up the crucial doctrine of polygamy because they felt that that would be forfeiting a core doctrine of the faith. But eventually, by 1889, Wilford Woodruff, then practicing as the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, even though he was not yet LDS president, in part because the Quorum of the 12 and First Presidency couldn't even gather together, he realized the writing on the wall. And he actually entered into secret negotiations with the government that would eventually result in the church giving up polygamy, especially after a series of new legislation and Supreme Court verdicts that ratified everything that had come before. So by late 1889, Wilford Woodruff starts secretly telling people that, hey, we're not going to be entering into new plural marriages, at least as far as the government understands. By the summer of 1890, Wilford Woodruff is giving that instruction wider, and then in response to a number of media requests in September of 1890, Wilford Woodruff, with the assistance of George Buchanan, remember the guy who was in prison, he was arguably the most powerful member of the church in the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s, they draft what comes to be known as the Manifesto, saying the church is no longer practicing polygamy. We are abiding by the laws of man. And then the government, especially the Secretary of State, said, okay, that manifesto is good, but now it has to be read in General Conference. So they read it in the October 1890 General Conference, and it was delivered to a sustaining vote, which was a very hard vote for thousands of saints who had risked their lives and had gone to jail for that principle that the church has now given up for political and legal reasons. There's also key evidence that the church did not really believe that they were giving up polygamy. 4 days after the manifesto was issued, one apostle, John W. Taylor, the son of John Taylor, was sealed to another plural wife by Francis Lyman, another member of the Quorum of the 12, as they were riding around Salt Lake City in a carriage. Wilford Woodruff himself likely took another plural wife several years later. In fact, they soon created a secret code system through which they could send people to Mexico or Canada to be polygamously sealed. And so the number of those who continue to practice plural marriage, including with leadership approval, actually slightly rose as we approached 1900 in the first few years of the 20th century. But then things had to change again. Because in 1903, the Utah legislature selected Reed Smoot, a Latter-day Saint apostle, to be Utah's senator. This is back in the days when senators were chosen by state legislatures. And when Reed Smoot arrived in Washington, D.C., there were obviously lots of people who were like, hey, we can't really trust an LDS authority. We're just a few years removed from them giving up polygamy and theocracy. And in fact, we don't really believe they forfeited either. And so they started a multi-year congressional hearing into not just Reed Smoot, but the entire LDS tradition. And it very quickly became apparent that polygamy was continuing and that LDS leaders were enabling polygamy and actually solemnizing new plural unions. And so the LDS prophet at the time, Joseph F. Smith, he realized that they had to make some concession to the government. He believed that for Mormonism to flourish going forward, they had to be on better terms with the government and the nation. And this was one concession that would be necessary. So in the April of 1904 General Conference, Joseph F. Smith issued what came to be known as the Second Manifesto, which was basically him saying, hey, we really mean it this time, guys. We're really stopping polygamy. The problem was not all the apostles, let alone all the members, agreed with it. They saw it as a political ploy. There were several church leaders, including Heber J. Grant, who was a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles at the time, who wrote very pointed letters to Joseph F. Smith saying, you are betraying our cause and we need to stand firm on our doctrine. They actually said that the whole Reed Smoot thing is a disaster and we need to call him back and we shouldn't give any concessions abroad. But Joseph F. Smith moved forward, and eventually the next year, the target from the national government focused on 3 Mormon apostles. Merrill Mariner, who was an older apostle, John W. Taylor, the younger son of John Taylor, and Matthias Cowley. All of these three were apostles, and the government had clear evidence that all 3 were still solemnizing plural unions. Now, Merrill eventually dies due to old age, so he falls out of the attention, but both Taylor and Cowley refused to testify in Congress. They also refused to stand up and support the Second Manifesto. So both of them were dropped from the Quorum of the 12 Apostles at the April Conference of 1905 to the gasps of the general LDS audience. And all 3 of those apostles, Merrill, Taylor, and Cowley, were replaced by monogamous apostles, a embodied shift of the church's priorities. That continued on for several more years. And in fact, it wasn't until 1909 when there was further media attention on the continued polygamous sealings taking place in the LDS Church. At this point, the First Presidency of the Quorum of the 12 basically took a don't ask, don't tell policy, to where they kind of winked and nodded to stake presidents, high priests, temple sealers and temple presidents to continue doing plural marriages, just don't tell the leaders. But by 1909 and 1910, Joseph F. Smith decided, no, it is time to cut it out entirely. And they assigned Francis Lyman, the same apostle who had solemnized a plural union of John W. Taylor days after the 18 Manifesto. Now he was the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. Joseph F. Smith assigns Francis Lyman to go out and investigate, and they end up excommunicating dozens, if not hundreds, of Latter-day Saints, including local leaders and including John W. Taylor. They were excommunicated from the faith because they were still practicing polygamy. That showed how this is still going on 2 decades after the 18 Manifesto, and it's still not over. Because there was still a growing number of Latter-day Saints who were reading Doctrine and Covenants 132, Joseph Smith's revelation about polygamy, reading all the sermons from John Taylor and Brigham Young that declared that polygamy was a core doctrine of the LDS tradition, and believed that maybe the church has to give these political statements saying we're not practicing polygamy, but we really know the truth, and we're not giving it up. And that circle of secret polygamists, they start congregating around a small number of leaders. Among them, Loren Woolley and John W. Woolley. John W. Woolley was the father, Loren Woolley was the son. Both of them had been close to John Taylor. And in the 1920s, they start sharing the story about how John Taylor had allegedly received a revelation and ordained several men to continue on the priesthood authority of polygamy even after a church leader betrays the faith and gives up the practice. This small group of polygamists starts to expand in the 1920s and early 1930s. And then in 1933, J. Reuben Clark gets added to the first presidency. Ironically, J. Reuben Clark was a cousin of the Woolleys, just to show how small that world was. And J. Reuben Clark, in many ways, shapes modern Mormonism. That's a key argument in my book. But one of the ways he does this is he decides we need to cut out this ulcer, this cancer of Mormon polygamy. So he dictates a long document that is to be read in every church service, denouncing polygamy, denying that church leaders ever sanctioned polygamy after 1890, and threatening to excommunicate anyone who says or does otherwise. That 1933 memo that is read in church services is what comes to be known as the Third Manifesto. And Clark does not end there. He works with policemen to try to arrest those practicing polygamy. One of the great ironies of now church leaders using the state laws criminalizing cohabitation against the fundamentalists. He works with the post office to censor mail of documents that are supporting the fundamentalist movement. He works with libraries to censor the books that might be used by fundamentalists. He does all he can to try to root out those fundamentalists. But instead of killing the fundamentalist movement, his actions spark its birth, because now they realize they can't exist within the LDS tradition. They have to create their own. They start their own newspaper. They embrace the term fundamentalist, which at first was used as an epithet, and they start baptizing and organizing their own ecclesiastical institution. And many of them move down to Short Creek, where they form the hub of the Mormon fundamentalist movement, all in response to that Third Manifesto in 1933. If you want to read more about that, I strongly recommend Christina Rossetti's article on the topic, using a great term that came from the critics of J. Reuben Clark from those years, who said that he suffered from a case of hysteria excommunicatis. But the shadow of polygamy continues to remain within the LDS tradition. On the one hand, the doctrine of polygamy has never been renounced. It is still LDS doctrine that a man can be sealed to multiple women in the eternities. In fact, in the recent biography of Dallin H. Oaks, who's currently a member of the First Presidency, we read from his diaries where after his first wife, June Dixon, dies and he's courting a second wife, Kristen McMain, he makes it clear to her that she needs to be okay with being a second wife in the eternities. Now, there have been many, including Carol Lynn Pearson, who wrote a book, The Ghost of Polygamy, that shows how this doctrine of polygamy still shapes how many Mormon men and women approach gender and family and the eternities. And further, the LDS institution itself has often been shaped in relation to both the legacies of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young's polygamy, but also the fundamentalist movement itself. When I was writing my book, American Zion, I was shocked at how many moves the LDS institution took whenever there was national attention on the fundamentalists. And so you can't understand the LDS movement without understanding the fundamentalists, and you can't understand the internal dynamics of the LDS Church, whether it be doctrine or practice or gender, without understanding these remaining legacies of polygamy. Because at its heart is a crucial question that's at the core of all of Mormonism: is what do you do with the revelation that no longer fits modern day standards? How do you rescind a revelation on polygamy? Because as long as Doctrine and Covenants 132, Joseph Smith's revelation on polygamy, remains in the LDS scriptural canon, the faith is still going to be struggling with that revelation and doctrine and polygamy. And the fact that it took 3 manifestos and nearly half a century to move from that practice shows how deeply encoded polygamy was in Mormonism. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you haven't yet, go and watch my other videos on polygamy, whether it be my video on Joseph Smith and the origins of polygamy, or my So You Want to Know More About Polygamy video, where I talk about books and articles that I strongly recommend. I have other videos on Mormonism and American religion and politics, so please subscribe, like, and share. History has never been more relevant, and I'm thrilled to be sharing this fascinating stuff with you.